I came back from my father's funeral to find bulldozers on my family's farmland, 3,500 acres, gone from the county record books like it never belonged to us. The HOA claimed they acquired it legally. But they didn't know who they were messing with. I wasn't just mourning anymore. I was ready to reclaim everything. Before I show you how I turned their neighborhood into a regret-filled ghost town, make sure you watch till the end. The gravel cracked beneath my boots as I stepped out of the truck and into the quiet ruin of what used to be home. Where wheat once danced in golden waves, now there were stakes in the dirt, flags marked Lot 12, and heavy machinery sitting like beasts in hibernation. My father had died just a week ago, and I had returned not just to bury him, but to claim what was still ours. Instead, I was greeted by a corporate horror story. Someone had sold the land while we were grieving. I walked the perimeter in silence, the morning fog still clinging to the furrows in the earth. This wasn't just property. It was heritage. My great-grandfather had tilled this soil with his bare hands. My father never missed a planting season, not once in 50 years. And now, signs for Oak Valley Estates, luxury countryside living, were planted like spears in the ground. My chest tightened. No phone call. No offer. Just theft in slow motion. I made my first call to the county records office. I expected a mistake. Instead, I got the shock of a lifetime. The title had been transferred 2 months ago, right after my father was hospitalized. The seller? A shadow LLC affiliated with the local HOA. The transaction had slid through with forged documentation and a fake trustee signature, and no one had bothered to verify it. My father had dementia. They'd preyed on that. And the county had looked the other way. It felt like a nightmare unraveling in daylight. The farmland wasn't just some empty field to them, it was an investment opportunity. Subdivision blueprints had already been filed. The concrete wasn't poured yet, but the destruction was well underway. Trees had been cleared. A temporary sales office was already installed near the old barn. I stood there, watching a woman hand brochures to a couple on folding chairs, brochures selling land that still legally belonged to my bloodline. That night, I didn't sleep. I went through every document my father had stored in the safe. Deeds, boundaries, trustee filings, notarized land trust agreements, all intact, all valid. The real title was never transferred. It was a fake. They had built a lie out of paper and ink and expected no one to read it. But I did. And I understood what it meant. I could either fight a slow court battle, or I could turn the system they abused against them. The next day, I hired a private investigator and a real estate law firm from outside the county. I didn't want anyone with ties to the local HOA corruption. Within a week, they traced the shell companies. Turns out, the HOA president and 2 board members were funneling HOA dues into land grabs, acquiring farmland through pressure, bribes, and forged claims. Mine wasn't the first, but it would be the last. I called a family friend, an old cattleman who now ran a private land auction firm. I didn't tell him everything. Just enough. I need to move some land. Quietly. Fast. He agreed, and we set up the infrastructure behind the scenes. Simultaneously, I filed a motion with the court to freeze any pending construction permits on my parcel, citing active title dispute and suspected fraud. Within 48 hours, the court issued a temporary injunction. Construction paused. And panic started to ripple. Karen, yes, her actual name, the HOA president, showed up at the field in a luxury SUV. She tried to talk things out, offering me a private settlement. Her tone was sweet, but her eyes were cold. I refused to shake her hand. "You're standing on stolen dirt," I said flatly. She laughed. "You can't stop progress." I nodded. "Watch me." The sales office shut its door the next morning. HOA board members stopped answering calls. The pressure built faster than I expected. And behind it all, my auction team had quietly found a buyer, a conservation trust backed by a private donor who wanted to preserve farmland and had no love for suburban sprawl. The paperwork was finalized under NDA. The price? More than fair. The timing? Perfect. Exactly 21 days after Karen thought she owned my land, I sold the entire parcel, all 3,500 acres, in a single overnight transaction. Not to developers. Not to the county. But to an entity that made resale and development impossible. Oak Valley Estates was dead before its foundation was laid. And when Karen found out who now held the deed, she collapsed in the county office parking lot. 3 days after the deed transfer, Oak Valley Estates became a graveyard of broken contracts. The local papers hadn't caught on yet, but inside the planning office, panic had started to bloom like mold in a damp basement. A chain of emails leaked, HOA board members desperately trying to spin a narrative, blaming the real estate team, the title company, anyone but themselves. But the paper trail was tight. Their names were everywhere, signatures in ink they couldn't erase. Karen tried to strike back. She filed a countersuit, claiming malicious interference with public development. Her lawyer must have been desperate or blind, because within 2 court sessions, the suit was thrown out. The judge used the word audacious to describe their actions. My lawyer leaned over and whispered, "That's legal speak for you just lost everything." I didn't smile. Not yet. The Conservation Trust, now legal owner of the land, sent a formal notice to the HOA. Any construction, alteration, or trespass on the property would be prosecuted under state and federal preservation laws. They backed it up with armed patrols, not men with rifles, but enforcement agents with clipboards and court orders. One agent escorted a subcontractor off the land when he tried to re-enter with a bulldozer. That video went viral before I even saw it. HOA arrogance versus the law, and the law finally had teeth. I drove out to the land one quiet morning, just to feel the silence again. The wind carried no engines, no shouting foremen, no heavy tires crushing the soil. It was just me, the horizon, and the subtle creak of grass remembering its freedom. A hawk circled overhead. Somewhere deep in my chest, grief was finally giving way to peace, because the soil beneath my feet had been defended. Not just for me, but for every farmer whose name had been erased from deeds like a pencil mark. The real fallout came in waves. Residents who had already paid deposits on Oak Valley lots began filing lawsuits. Dozens of them. One woman had sold her home based on a promised move-in date. Another family had enrolled their kids in the nearby school district. Lives were paused, finances wrecked, all because the HOA decided they were above the law. Karen stopped attending meetings. Her SUV was gone from the driveway. Word spread she'd moved in with her sister across the county. Her real estate license was suspended. Meanwhile, I wasn't done. See, while I had sold the land to the trust, I still owned the mineral rights beneath it. And when I dug deeper into the land's records, I found something strange, an abandoned aquifer mapping from the 1970s, never fully explored. I hired a team to scan it properly. What we found wasn't oil or gas, it was a massive underground freshwater reserve, untapped and clean. In a drought-prone county, that was gold. I contacted state environmental regulators and the trust. We struck a deal. The land above would remain untouched, a preserved sanctuary. But beneath, a carefully monitored water rights lease could provide clean irrigation access to nearby farms and passive revenue for me for decades. Karma, it turns out, flows underground. The final blow came when a federal investigation opened into the HOA's finances. Turns out, they hadn't just stolen land. They'd misused hundreds of thousands in member dues. Lavish retreats, private landscaping projects, even political donations. The HOA wasn't just broken, it was rotten to the core. By year's end, the entire board had resigned. The subdivision was renamed, stripped of its original HOA structure, and placed under county management. I stood at the edge of the now empty Oak Valley sales lot one last time. Weeds curled around the wooden frame where the sales banner once stood. A tumbleweed rolled by, cinematic as ever. The land had been stolen. But I had taken it back. And in the process, I had revealed the truth. Some things may be buried, but they're never gone. Not when you dig deep enough. 3 months passed. The land, once a battlefield of injustice, now lay still, not in defeat, but in renewal. Wild grass returned in scattered waves. Birds had come back to nest in the trees that hadn't been cut down. The roads meant to lead to luxury cul-de-sacs now led nowhere, just dead ends carved into silence. I spent my mornings walking those broken paths, boots crunching softly over gravel that would never become driveways. And every morning, I felt something lift, like the weight of 100 ancestors finally resting. My father's old tractor still sat by the barn, rusted and quiet. I didn't move it. I let it stay, like a monument, a reminder of what had been. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch of the farmhouse with a cup of coffee and just stare out at the fields. The horizon looked unchanged, but everything beyond it had transformed. There was justice now, silent, slow, but real. And I hadn't just won for myself. I had set a precedent. The HOA's collapse had become a case study across the state. County newsletters began covering it. A YouTube legal commentator broke down the farmland fraud scandal in a 20-minute video that got millions of views. I watched it once, seeing my story told by someone else, dramatized, with maps and legal diagrams. It was surreal. But the most surreal moment was when I got a letter from a farmer 2 counties over. His land had been threatened by his own HOA. But after hearing what I'd done, he fought back, and won. That's when I knew the story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a ripple. A message. People started calling me for advice. Some offered to buy the land again, developers who promised green solutions and sustainable communities. I declined every time. Not a single inch would be sold. Instead, I worked with the trust to develop walking trails, wildlife corridors, and even a learning center where kids could visit to understand what real agriculture meant. The land wasn't just preserved, it was now a living classroom. Then came the county fair. They invited me to speak. I didn't want to. Public attention had never been my thing. But the organizer, an old schoolteacher who'd known my father, said something that stuck. If you don't tell them how you fought back, someone else will write the story, and they'll get it wrong. So I stood on the wooden stage, under a low sun, in front of a crowd of dusty hats and wrinkled boots, and I spoke. I told them about the fraud. The forged papers. The audacity of people who think a pen can erase a lifetime. I told them about my father and the sweat that soaked into this soil. I told them how easily we lose things and how much harder it is to reclaim them once lost. There wasn't a sound in the tent by the time I was done. Just wind outside, moving the canvas. Someone clapped. Then another. And then everyone stood. Legacy doesn't die. Not if you guard it. That's what I learned. Later that night, I walked the fence line one last time before winter would roll in. The stars above felt closer than ever, like the sky itself was watching. I stopped by the oldest oak tree on the land, the one where my father used to rest during long harvest days. I touched its trunk, rough and solid, and for the first time in months, I cried. Not from grief. From gratitude. The land was still ours. They tried to erase us. But I'd carved the truth into the foundation. Not with anger. With resolve. And they would never forget it. Winter crept in slow that year, blanketing the fields in a quiet gray light. Frost clung to every fence post, every blade of dry grass. My boots left crisp impressions in the earth as I walked the same path my father once did, past the old barn, down toward the creek that marked the southern edge of our land. It had been months since the battle ended. The lawsuits were over. The HOA dissolved. But peace doesn't come from a court ruling. It comes in moments like these, when the world stops spinning and lets you breathe. News trucks stopped showing up. The headlines faded. But in the silence, something else bloomed: legacy. The land didn't just recover, it healed. Where the machines had torn trenches, new shoots rose up. Oaks that had been marked for removal now stood untouched, their branches defiant against the wind. And every time I passed them, I felt like the land was whispering, "I remember. I was never yours to sell." One cold afternoon, I found an envelope taped to my front gate. No name, no return address, just a folded letter inside. It was from a former HOA member. He had resigned quietly before the collapse. Said he never agreed with what they'd done but hadn't spoken up. "Your fight reminded me what silence costs," it read. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything when it mattered." I stared at the letter for a long time. Then I folded it back and placed it in the drawer beside my father's will. Justice doesn't always look like flashing sirens or courtroom drama. Sometimes it's a stranger saying "I'm sorry." Sometimes it's the quiet turning of the seasons, spring returning to soil once stripped bare. Sometimes it's a gate no one dares unlock again because they know now who stands behind it. That spring, the local university reached out. They wanted to partner with me and the Conservation Trust to turn the farmland into a living lab, a place where students could study soil, sustainability, and history. Not just agriculture, but the culture of land itself. I agreed on one condition: every visitor must learn what happened here. Not the scandal. The resistance. The reclamation. I wanted every student to know what it means to fight quietly, relentlessly, for what is yours. The dedication ceremony was small but honest. A wooden plaque was placed at the old trailhead, where the sales office once stood. It read, "This land was almost lost." But the roots were deeper than they knew. I stood there as they read it aloud. Birds chirped in the nearby trees. A kid tossed pebbles into the dry creek. A teacher knelt to explain to her class why no homes were ever built here. I didn't interrupt. The land was doing the storytelling now. In town, people still whispered the story. The man who bankrupted an HOA. The farmer who flipped the script. Most of it was dramatized, reshaped in cafes and barbershops. I never corrected them. Let them have their legends. I had the truth, and that was enough. The people who mattered knew the real story. My father. My neighbors. That old soil that still remembered our names. One night, as lightning cracked far in the distance, I walked alone to the edge of the property where HOA workers had first staked their signs. The posts were gone, but I could still picture them, bold red letters claiming what they never owned. I crouched down and placed my hand flat on the dirt. The ground was firm. Cold. Steady. And I realized then, I hadn't just won land back. I had one time. Time to breathe. Time to teach. Time to remember. The HOA's name would fade, their plans erased, but this land, our land, would carry our story forward. Unbothered. Unbroken. Unforgettable.